Skills are a lot more important than most people think. They're not just instructions or a convenient way to package a prompt. They're the mechanism for transferring your knowledge and expertise directly to AI. Think of it like the Matrix. Skills are the program that gets loaded into Neo's brain. In the same way, we can load our engineering workflows, marketing frameworks, and analysis methods into our agents. I often describe skills as the new basic unit of knowledge work, and I say that because the best engineers don't write code anymore, right? They spend most of their time in planning mode, drafting specs that the agent then implements. So the work is shifting from doing to directing, and skills are how you encode that direction. And this isn't just an Anthropic thing anymore. Skills are universal, and I would say that they're the most important thing to be learning in AI right now, especially if you're a knowledge worker. In this video, I'm going to briefly break down what skills are and then walk you through the most important concepts you need to really master skills. We'll go from the basics like progressive disclosure to more advanced stuff like evals and self-improvement. And I'll try to keep things approachable, so if you are newer to skills, you should be able to follow along even through the advanced topics. Now, I'm very sure that this will be the most comprehensive overview of agent skills on YouTube, so make sure to watch all the way through to the end because I'm sure you're going to learn some useful things. Let's start with defining what a skill is. A skill is essentially just a folder with some files. It has to, at a minimum, have a file called skill.md, and it has to be named exactly like this. It's a convention. Inside of the skill.md is where we're going to have our instructions for how Claude should carry out this skill. As an example, here's a skill of mine called YouTube Data. And this skill is for working with the YouTube Data API. The skill.md is comprised of two parts. We have the part up here, which is called the front matter, and this is going to contain some metadata about the skill. At the very minimum, you want to have a name and a description up here. Now, the description is by far the most critical component of the front matter. It's the only way that Claude understands what the skill is and when to use it. We'll get into exactly how to write optimized descriptions later when we talk about skill triggering. But besides name and description, there are a ton of other front matter fields that are going to give you more fine-grained control and allow you to optimize your skills. For example, two common front matter fields that you might want to include are for model and effort. And these allow you to use a specific model and also thinking effort level when the skill is active. So that way you can configure your skills individually based on the skill's intelligence needs. Down here, you can also see that we can specify hooks for the skill. And if you're not familiar with hooks, they just allow you to trigger an action when a specific condition is met. So this is really useful for triggering things like quality gates or checking output criteria for that specific skill without loading it globally. Here's an example where we have a skill to execute secure operations, and we have a hook that's a pre-tool use hook, which is going to trigger anytime Claude tries to run a bash command. So maybe this skill touches sensitive data, and we want to automatically run a security check to identify risks in the command that Claude is trying to run. And remember, this is only triggered while the skill is active. So everything else Claude does with bash, if it's outside of the skill, it's going to run normally without doing the security check. Another non-coding example is if you had a writing skill, for example, writing a newsletter, you can have a skill hook like this that checks for various criteria like word count, content structure, etc. So it's a really powerful way to add some deterministic checks to a skill rather than solely relying on the instructions that you're giving Claude. And being able to bundle hooks with skills makes them even more powerful now. I'll include the full reference for the front matter fields in the description below. Now let's look at some more complicated skills. So I mentioned that skills only have the required skill.md file that they need, but you can pretty much include anything in the skills folder. In this guide from Anthropic, they're highlighting these 3 additional folders. So these are some pretty common folders that you'll see packaged in the skills, where references is going to be for documentation, scripts is going to be for any code that you can execute. Typically, this is going to have any tools you want Claude to be able to actually do things. So they can be scripts, they can also connect MCPs or connect to APIs, for example. And then assets is going to be any templates, fonts, icons, images, etc. that you want to use to create output. Here's another example of an art skill from Daniel Miesler. And you can see in his art skill, here's the skill MD file. And we have a bunch of other folders that we haven't even mentioned yet. So again, it's arbitrary what you include. You can name folders anything. So that covers the anatomy of skills, but how do you actually install them and where do the skill folders and files live? For the most part, there's just 3 locations that you should be aware of. One is at the user level, or what we call global skills. And this is probably the most common place you'll want to create your skills if you are writing a lot of skills yourself. Anything that's created in your user level skills folder is going to be available to Claude anywhere you use Claude on your system. That's going to be the same for any skills that you have installed from plugins. So if you run the /plugin command in Claude Code and you install a marketplace plugin that has skills, that's going to be at your user level.claude folder /plugins, and that's going to be available globally. The third location is if you create a skill in the .claude/skills folder within a specific project. Those skills are only available in that project. So I normally recommend creating skills at the user level so that they are available across all of your projects. Now, this is for Claude Code running locally on your computer, but like we mentioned earlier, the beauty of skills is that it's now an open standard, which makes them portable. So you can use the same skills that you create locally with Claude Code in the Claude web app or your desktop app or Claude Cowork. But not just that, they're also just plug and play to any other coding agent like Gemini or Codex. Quick plug before we jump into the meat of the video, which is if you just want to get started building your first skill, then check out my latest newsletter in the description, which is more of a quick start guide. You'll also find links to all of the skills I'm sharing and talking about in this video. While you're there, make sure to subscribe to my Substack, where I'm typically going to post more templates, guides, and deep dives that I can't always cover in my YouTube. All right, so we're all up to speed on what skills are. Let's talk about the first core concept of skills, which is progressive disclosure. And the whole idea here is simple. It's only load context when it's needed, which is going to help Claude not only work longer, but also produce better outputs. Here's the simple 3-level mental model for progressive disclosure. The metadata for the skill is always loaded into Claude's context. So anytime you start up Claude, the metadata for every skill that you've connected is already in Claude's context. Whereas the skill body that has the actual instructions for the skill, as well as any other included resources that you have in that skill folder, is not yet loaded. So if this bar on the left is Claude's context window, this green section will always be filled up with these metadata, and Claude has to make a decision whether it wants to use a skill or not just based on the name and description. Once Claude does trigger a skill, it's then going to read the body of the skill with all of the instructions for what to do in that skill. And within that skill, you can point to these other bundled resources as necessary. So if, for example, we're telling Claude to read the style guide, it'll then go and read that document inside of references. And so you'll continue filling up the context window as you go deeper and read more files. In general, a good rule of thumb is if Claude doesn't need it every time it needs to run the skill, then you should probably move it out of the skill.md. Coming back to the YouTube data skill, we have this references folder, and inside we have some API documentation. And we could just as easily pack everything that's in this API document into this skill MD file itself. But clearly that goes against the principles we just discussed. And the reason is because Claude doesn't need to read the full API documentation every time. It's only there as a reference in case it encounters an error and needs to debug it. So including all of the API docs would just be consuming unnecessary tokens. So just remember that progressive disclosure improves our context efficiency, which is important, but it's equally important to minimize noise or irrelevant information that we're putting into the context window, which would distract Claude. And this has been shown to dramatically improve the output of agents. One of the most common failure modes for skills is when Claude doesn't use or trigger a skill when you actually wanted it to. The skill description is the most important lever you have to control when Claude actually triggers skills, because remember that Claude is only going to decide whether it wants to use a skill from the conversation plus the skill's front matter, since that's all it sees. Good descriptions should always include two things: what the skill does and when to trigger it. And arguably, when to trigger is probably the most important thing to have in your descriptions, because giving Claude examples of when you want it to use the skill is going to make it a lot more reliable. So in this example, on the left, we just say what the skill does. And then on the right, we have that same first line, but then we're adding use whenever the user mentions dashboards, data visualization, or internal metrics. And you can see how if we mention, these prompts, Claude could easily miss triggering this skill because it's not clear that for these specific use cases, it should use this skill. Whereas in this case, we've already explicitly mentioned that for most of these use cases, it should trigger this skill. So again, be explicit about the use cases for when you want Claude to use the skill, as well as any trigger prompts, like when the user says this. Another best practice that applies to not only skills, but honestly across MCPs and subagents, basically any kind of tool that you would connect to Claude, is to create skills that do one specific thing and ideally have no overlap with anything else. Because remember that the complete set of loaded MCP tools, subagents, skills, etc., everything that's in Claude's context window is essentially competing for Claude's attention. So in this example, if this is Claude's context window and you have a mix of tools, agents, skills, all with really similar names and potentially descriptions, then if the user tells Claude to optimize my blog SEO, you can see how it would be a little confusing on which of these it should actually use. So instead of that, you should have very clearly scoped skills and tools that do a specific thing, and more importantly, that have completely unique triggers. And that's going to avoid Claude using the wrong thing at the wrong time. Now, we already saw that you can bundle pretty much anything with a skill. So let's talk more about the scripts folder, which is typically where we connect our skill specific tools. So I'm in my Nano Banana skill, which is used to generate Nano Banana images from the Gemini API. And in the scripts folder, I have these two Python scripts. This generate file has a bunch of functions for working with the Gemini API. And the thing is, Claude can easily generate a Gemini API call from scratch. But if you're generating many images or generating them regularly, Claude would be wasting tons of tokens by regenerating the same commands to call the API, while the commands, for the most part, don't change. So instead of writing all of these API calls every time, we can create a script like this that does all of the heavy lifting. And then in the actual skill MD file where we have the instructions, Claude only has to run a simple command like this to use the script and then pass in a prompt to generate it. So this is obviously going to make Claude a lot more efficient at this workflow. And by bundling the exact tools that Claude requires to perform a skill, we reduce any outside dependencies. And again, that makes this skill portable and plug and play. So no matter where we want to use it, Whether we want to share the folder with a coworker or use it in something else like Codex, we can, because everything you need to run the skill is already inside of it. Now let's talk about evals. So evals give you a framework or system for evaluating your skills performance. And I think the best way to run evals by far is to just use Anthropic's official skill creator skill that we use to create skills. Actually, I should mention that if you're not familiar, Anthropic has its own official skill for creating skills called Skill Creator. And you can install this yourself from their official marketplace by running the /plugin command. And then you can search for this plugin in their marketplace. But I recommend using the Skill Creator anytime you want to create a new skill or update a skill or run evals. And the reason is because you can imagine that Anthropic collects a ton of data through all of their Claude users. So they're constantly seeing and analyzing what works in skills, what usage patterns versus what kinds of failure modes they see most often. And they're going to bake that into this meta skill for creating skills. Same thing with testing and generating evals. But yeah, this skill creator skill gives Claude specific instructions on how to generate evals and test your skills as well as creating them. Coming back to how evals work, we have this core loop for evals where we're going to generate some test prompts. These are going to be a few realistic user messages. And then we're going to run an A/B test where we're going to run all of the test prompts through Claude when that skill is turned off versus when that skill is turned on. And then we'll compare the outputs, grade them, and then if we identify any gaps, then we can improve the skill and basically repeat this until the skill is passing most of our criteria. As far as grading goes, there are typically two categories of evals. You have quantitative for things that you can actually measure. So this would be things like counting the number of failed tool calls, failed requirements like the word count being higher than the skill mentioned, or detecting how many hashtags were used. So stuff like that where you can actually measure it. And then you have the qualitative stuff, which is going to be more of your subjective opinion of if the output is good or not. So that could be for evaluating things like tone or writing style, or did it sound like my voice? So I think the quantitative evals is pretty straightforward. These are just tests that Claude can run itself because it really doesn't take any opinion. So I want to spend a little more time on the qualitative evals, which you can run yourself by just telling Claude. Once you have that skill creator skill installed, you can just tell Claude that you want to run evals on your skill. For this example, I have a hook skill that's used for writing engaging hooks for different content types. And in this case, I wanted to run evals for generating YouTube video hooks. Claude came up with its own set of 3 different test prompts, and then it ran those 3 test prompts using subagents that either had the hook skill or didn't have the hook skill. And then it generates this nice HTML viewer where we can actually see the evals, and then we can type in our own review so that we can input our own feedback. Here's the first test prompt that Claude came up with. I need a hook for my next YouTube video. The title is Build an AI Agent in 10 Minutes with Claude. So notice that this one is with a skill. So let's see what it looks like with a skill. So in this one, we actually see the full analysis, not just the hook, but it actually walks us through all of the steps it's taking. It's almost like the thinking tokens. And then finally here is the actual hook. So it even gives us what should be on screen, and then says that the voiceover is going to be, this agent just researched a topic, drafted a full report, and saved it to my desktop. Let me show you how I built it. So this is the hook with the skill. And then if we hit next, we can see for the same prompt, this is going to be the output without a skill. Already you can see it is a bit longer. So everyone's talking about AI agents. Most people have never actually built one. They think you need a CS degree, a complex framework, and weeks of setup. You don't. In the next 10 minutes, I'm going to build a fully working AI agent from scratch, and I'm going to do it live. right here so you can follow along and build yours too. So you can see it is quite different. It's a little more verbose, a lot longer to read. And so if I wanted to, I can scroll all the way down here, and then you can see that there is a section for me to add feedback. And when you're done with that, you can click on submit all reviews, and then Claude will incorporate your feedback. Now, of course, you can do this for all 3 test prompts by just continuing to scroll right. This is the second test prompt, and it will generate the test prompts to test different things. So if we look at the last one, this was kind of a different scenario where we're telling Claude we actually already have a hook, and then we're asking if Claude can improve it. So this is kind of testing a different angle. There's also a second tab here called benchmark where you can see all of the test results, because Claude is going to run its own evals in addition to generating that review page for you to input your own opinions. Here we can see that based on the evals that Claude ran, with the skill we had 100% pass rate, and without it was 63%. So you can see what the breakdown was for each skill. This was the first prompt to build an AI agent in 10 minutes. And we can compare the pass rate. So with the skill was 6 out of 6, whereas we only passed 3 out of 6 without the skill. And here is the actual breakdown for what it was. So we repeated the title when we didn't have the skill, which is a rule that we have inside of the skill to never repeat the title. And then here you can see without the skill, it was too long. And we also didn't use any kind of proven pattern when we didn't have the skill. This is a really great systematic approach to improving your skills by running tests. The great thing about evals is that because skills are bundled with all of their required context, resources, and tools, when you run evals, you're testing a lot more than just the skill.md instructions. You're going to catch things like failed tool calls, bugs in your scripts, broken file references. So it's really testing a skill's effectiveness end to end. Now, another specific eval that skill creator skill can run for you is trigger optimization. So in this eval, Claude will generate 10 to 20 test prompts, and half of them should trigger the skill, whereas the other half are specific test prompts that should not trigger the skill. It'll again generate this web page viewer, and you can scroll through and see each one of the test prompts. You can actually come in here and edit those prompts yourself if you want to make them maybe a little more realistic, and also toggle them if you want to move them from they should trigger or they should not trigger. Then once you feel good about it, you can click on export that eval set, and Claude will actually run it and tell you what the pass fail rates are. So then based on that, you can identify gaps in the description and go ahead and have Claude update the description so that it triggers more accurately. So to summarize, evals can be very powerful for catching edge cases and improving the quality of your outputs as well as the triggering accuracy for skills. Evals are great when you're creating a new skill. They help you test against simple mistakes or bad skill design and catch and fix issues early before you start using the skill. But most people stop once they've created their skill, and the problem is that until you start testing and using your skill in your real workflows, you won't know where it fails in practice. This is where having a process to improve your skills over time is really important. The easiest way to do this is to have a command or a skill that tells Claude to review this current session and identify any gaps and areas for improvement. You can then run this in the session where you noticed that a skill didn't work quite as expected. For example, I have this skill called the skill retro, and it's going to carry out these 6 steps where it's going to process the session data, basically the conversation, all of the tool calls, etc. It's then going to analyze all of that to identify skill errors or points of friction. And then it's going to interpret and recommend updates to the skill to fix those errors. It'll then find the source location for the skill and then implement the improvements. So this is obviously a much more comprehensive kind of advanced version of this, but you can have a super simple prompt or slash command that just says, look at the current conversation and identify where this skill failed, and then suggest improvements that we can make to the skill. And again, if you want to get this specific retro skill, it will be in the newsletter on Substack. Finally, I want to talk about a couple of design patterns that work really well. The first is the workflow pattern, and the second is compounding skills. So let's look at the workflow pattern, and we kind of already saw what this looked like earlier, but the idea is that you can have a single skill that efficiently spans dozens of workflows. So this is a great way to organize your different SOPs, automations, processes, etc. into a single skill. For a great example of this, we can come back to Daniel Miesler's art skill and take a look at this skill.md file. This is going to contain general instructions like what tools Claude should use for actually generating the images. But then image-specific instructions like style guidelines, design patterns, the vibe, character designs all live within workflow-specific files. And then looking at the skill.md file here, it essentially becomes a router that sends Claude to the appropriate workflow. Now you might think, why don't we just make all of these separate skills, like for creating comic illustrations or mermaid diagrams? And for one, this is a nice way to nest a ton of functionality under one skill that keeps things organized, where all of these skills are related to each other and may even be using the same tools. And it's going to be a lot more organized for Claude, because while Claude can support hundreds of skills, as we've discussed, you may find that having too many skills actually hurts your performance. And again, that goes back to this idea that we want to minimize the amount of information that we're loading into the context window and not giving Claude too many options where it can get confused. The second pattern is this idea of compounding skills, where you can build skills on top of other skills. So my Nano Banana skill, for example, does one thing. It generates images. And if I want to create a skill that's specialized in creating high converting YouTube thumbnails, I can just tell Claude inside of the skill.md file to go use the Nano Banana skill for the actual image generation. I don't need to reinvent the wheel and rebuild the Nano Banana functionality inside of my new thumbnail skill. So I create the Nano Banana skill once, and now I unlock this new functionality for all of my skills and agents. At the same time, we can have other skills like, for example, this LinkedIn carousel generator skill, use that same underlying skill. So now you can imagine you could have many skills using the one Nano Banana skill. And the cool thing about this is that if we ever upgrade the Nano Banana skill, then all downstream skills that use the Nano Banana skill are going to automatically have that improvement. So we only need to make the upgrade or changes in one place. And that goes back to even running evals. So if we find ways to improve that skill, then all of the downstream skills get to benefit from that. Now this does introduce a dependency between skills, because now both YouTube thumbnails and the LinkedIn carousel skills require Nano Banana to be present. So this works especially well if the skills themselves are bundled together, like inside of a Claude plugin, so that they're always installed together. Finally, this LinkedIn carousels skill shows us another example where an individual skill can be built on top of multiple other skills. So you get these increasingly complex workflows where you really start to see compounding in the functionality of an individual skill. Here's a concrete example of that with another skill I have for planning YouTube videos. And you can see this skill actually only has a skill.md file. It doesn't have any additional references or documents or any added context. In here, it's just basically explaining a process to create a plan for a YouTube video, and it's going to be leveraging a bunch of other skills like for creating titles, for creating thumbnails, etc. And if you scroll through this, there's a ton of references to other skills like researching for YouTube videos. So this is an example where it's a thin orchestrator skill that is leveraging a bunch of other underlying skills. All right, so we've gone from the basics of what a skill is all the way through evals, self-improvement, and advanced design patterns. I hope you're walking away with a deeper understanding of skills and some actionable insights into how you can master them yourself. The more you invest in building and refining them, the more they compound over time. Now, don't forget, if you want to get started building your first skill or want the tools and templates I showed today, everything's linked in the description in my Substack. Make sure to subscribe there. I share a lot of implementation guides and shortcuts that don't make it into the videos. Thank you guys so much for watching and supporting this channel. And if you have any questions on what I covered today or want me to dig deeper on a specific topic, let me know in the comments and I'll see you in the next one.